You can support In the Past Lane with as little as $1 a month. Just go to the support page at our website, inthepastlane.com. Thanks. Immediately after the Boston Massacre occurred on March 5th, 1770, Paul Revere drew a vivid illustration of the incident, printed thousands of copies, and distributed them throughout the colonies. He hoped that this print would arouse resistance to what he saw as British tyranny. To ensure its acceptance in all the colonies, especially the South, Revere depicted an all-white crowd of colonists being gunned down by British soldiers, even though the crowd was multiracial, and one of the 5 men killed was a man of Native American and African-American heritage named Crispus Attucks. At a time when 20% of the American population was enslaved, it seems that for Paul Revere, including a black man in a liberty scene raised just too many questions. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 79, in which I speak with historian Mitch Kachun about his new biography of Crispus Attucks, the African-American man killed in the Boston Massacre. We are coming to you this week from the Bunker Hill Studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Leading us into the future, as always, is our magnificent executive producer, Lulu Spencer. So what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, I just returned from a fun week of vacation with my wife's family in Texas. Always a good time. Now I have a little more than 2 weeks to get ready for the next trip, a National Geographic circumnavigation cruise around Iceland. It's one of those small ships that holds only 125 passengers, and it makes 8 stops around the island. It's going to be pretty amazing, so you can expect a full report in late July. In other news, I've also conducted some great interviews for forthcoming episodes, including one with Andrew Shankman about his new book, Original Intents, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, and the American Founding, and also Katherine Kerrison about her book, Jefferson's Daughters, 3 Sisters, White and Black in a Young America. Also, In the Past Lane merchandise like t-shirts, mugs, and stickers is proving pretty popular. So thank you to all those who have purchased these items. Right now, the top-selling shirts are ones that say, Historians Against History Repeating Itself, and another one that reads, Okay, I'm begging you, America, stop repeating this shit. Signed, History. But there are lots more to choose from, including shirts with quotes about history by people like Confucius, Abraham Lincoln, James Baldwin, and more. Just go to our website, inthepastlane.com, and click on the merchandise button. Thanks. Okay, all that's left for me to say is, please subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you access your podcasts. And if you could, please leave a review. Super important. And Past Laners, please help us build our listening community by telling your friends about In the Past Lane. Personal recommendations are the most common ways that people discover new podcasts. So please, talk it up and maybe give us a shout out on social media. Thanks. Okay, people. I hear church bells sounding the alarm in downtown Boston. You know what that means. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. In this episode of In the Past Lane, perfectly timed with the July 4th holiday and the annual Spirit of 1776 hoopla, I speak with historian Mitch Kachun about his new book, The First Martyr of Liberty, Crispus Attucks in American Memory. In the course of our discussion, Mitch Kachun explains who Crispus Attucks was and what we know about why he was killed in the Boston Massacre. How, for many decades after the Boston Massacre and the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks was a forgotten figure in American history. That is, until African-American abolitionists in the 1840s and 1850s began to celebrate Attucks as a patriot, as a way to bolster their demand for an end to slavery and the inclusion of blacks as full citizens of the Republic. How and why in the decades after the Civil War, as freedoms won by African Americans were stripped away and replaced by Jim Crow white supremacy, black Americans clung to Crispus Attucks as a hero. As part of this process, they embellished his biography to make him appear every bit a patriot as Paul Revere and Samuel Adams. How the U.S. government used this image of Crispus Attucks, the patriot, as a way to recruit African Americans to fight in U.S. wars. How African American historians worked to have Crispus Attucks included in U.S. history textbooks, something that finally began to happen in the 1960s, during the era of the Civil Rights Movement. How some radical African American civil rights activists like Stokely Carmichael rejected Crispus Attucks as a model for black liberation. And how the story of Crispus Attucks and his presence, along with many other people of color at the Boston Massacre, serves as a useful reminder that American society has been diverse from the very beginning. Okay, time to talk to Mitch.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
All right, back at In the Past Lane, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and with me now is Mitch Kachun. He is professor of history at Western Michigan University, and he's the author of many scholarly articles and books, including Festivals of Freedom, Memory and Meaning in African American Emancipation Celebrations, 1808 to 1915. He's with me today to talk about his latest work, The First Martyr of Liberty, Crispus Attucks in American Memory. Mitch Kachun, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Well, thanks for having me, Ed. I appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Well, I'm very interested in your book about Crispus Attucks. And so the first question that comes to mind is, who was Crispus Attucks? I think everybody has encountered Crispus Attucks, at least as a person or as a fact in their U.S. history classes at some point, and know that he was one of 5 people killed in the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770, and that he was African American, which, of course, raises interesting questions about being African American, in a time of when most African Americans were enslaved, yet this is a great liberty moment. So who is Crispus Attucks? Tell us what is known about this figure.
Well, that's the $64 million question.
Yep.
Of course, we still don't really know very much, as you said, about who Crispus Attucks was. Yet, there are all these stories that have proliferated about him over the years, which is one of the things that really fascinated me about pursuing this research in the first place. So Attucks, as best we can tell, was a man of mixed race. Most accounts seem to present him as both a mixed African and Native American ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
Born probably in the 1720s in or around Framingham, Massachusetts, about 20 miles west of Boston. More than likely born enslaved. Liberated himself around 1750. We have evidence there was a newspaper advertisement offering a reward for the return of this runaway slave named Crispus from the Framingham area.
Mm-hmm.
And after 1750, lived as a free person, we presume. There is absolutely no historical evidence pointing to Crispus Attucks in the years between 1750 and 1770. He appears in the records because of his activities on the evening of March 5th, 1770, the so-called Boston Massacre, where, as you said, he and several other colonists were killed. And that's really the life story that we have. Yet there have been all sorts of stories that have tried to flesh that out and to create different kinds of narratives about the life of Crispus Attucks over the years.
Yeah. So before we get to that, which is really a fascinating look at historical memory and how it works and how it evolves, tell us a little bit more about, I guess, the Boston Massacre 101 and how Crispus Attucks finds himself in the middle of this key event in the years leading up to the American Revolution.
Sure. And again, in terms of the documentary evidence that we have, and a lot of this comes from the transcripts of the trial of the British soldiers who were on trial for murder for killing Attucks and the others. Attucks is clearly one of the main participants in this event, based on the testimony of several witnesses. One thing that we can know, while we're not sure exactly what his mindset was, what his thinking was, he was clearly not an innocent bystander, based on the evidence that I've looked at.
Right.
On the evening of March the 5th, there had been tensions growing between the British soldiers, and without going through all the minor scuffles and some major scuffles that took place leading up, these scuffles on the evening of March 5th sort of generated a mob of townspeople converging on first one British sentry, and then he called for reinforcements. So we had about 7 or 8 British sentries there around the custom house. And Crispus Attucks was a part of this mob. Some witnesses say that he was having dinner in a local tavern nearby, and the ringing of the bells, which came with the crowd action, brought him into the streets. He was seen carrying a large cordwood club in his hand, about the thickness of a man's forearms. So it was a substantial weapon for the time. And he was shouting taunts toward the British soldiers and trying to rally the mob to take some action against them and to, as he is quoted as saying by some witnesses, root them out. So he was actively involved. One witness actually has him placed at the very front of the crowd in front of the British soldiers and actually striking one of the British soldiers' muskets with this club. That's only one eyewitness account that shows him actually taking that aggressive action. But clearly he was a part of this mob that was threatening the British soldiers with clubs and chunks of ice and rocks being thrown at them, and eventually one and then more of them fired, killing a number of the crowd's people and wounding many others. So that's basically what we know about Attucks's involvement. He was hit with 2 musket balls in the chest and died pretty much on the spot.
And it's at this point, with his death, that your story really begins. The focus of your book really begins. Your subtitle is Crispus Attucks in American Memory. So it's really not so much the life of Crispus Attucks, it's the life of the idea and the memory of him. And each of your chapters examines the ways in which this example or this idea and memory of Crispus Attucks is reshaped in succeeding eras of American history, right down to the present day. So let's begin with that first period, roughly 1770 to 1840, which isn't so much a period of memory as it is amnesia. Tell us about how the Bostonians and other colonists understood the Boston Massacre and the place of the 5 martyrs, and specifically Crispus Attucks in those decades that followed the incident.
Well, the immediate reaction to this, again, the so-called Boston Massacre, that name itself is a piece of political propaganda defining this as a massacre. And this is how there was a lot of anti-British sentiment. We weren't into a full-blown movement toward independence in 1770.
Right.
But a lot of the anti-British sentiment really saw the British as an intrusion, a tyrannical power, and this killing of a small number of citizens really helped to feed that image. And they used the massacre in that way in the years following up until the end of the Revolution.
Right, sort of a vivid example of British tyranny.
Exactly. To maintain those fires of foment that had been brewing. But the first characterization of Attucks comes at the trial itself, when the soldiers' defense attorney, future President John Adams, defending these soldiers, trying to get them off on the charge of murder, characterized Attucks as this unsavory outsider. There are numerous quotations in his closing arguments in particular that really blame all of these events on Attucks. He made a point of identifying him as a person of mixed race. He referred to him as an Attucks of Framingham, which would convey to Bostonians that Framingham was a community in which there were quite a number of so-called praying towns of Christianized Indians in that area. And again, as identifying him as a mulatto, a person of mixed race, in many of the testimonies in the trial. Adams succeeded in creating this image of Attucks and the mob more generally as a group of unsavory outsiders. These people were not representative of the citizens of Boston. He at one point said, even to call them a mob is too good for them. So he was very successful in this characterization, and the soldiers got off, basically. But in the immediate aftermath, the citizenry of Boston maintained this characterization of the events as a massacre, and the individuals as citizens, as their brethren who were struck down in the streets, innocents struck down by this tyrannical military power. After he was initially identified racially in the news accounts around the events itself, and then again in the trial, very quickly those racial references disappeared.
Yeah.
And to the extent that these victims were mentioned at all, their names were mentioned just in passing, that these were the innocent Boston citizens who were struck down by the British troops. And annually, from 1771 through the end of the Revolution in 1783, Boston held annual March 5th commemorations of this massacre with sermons or speeches by prominent Bostonians, sort of retelling the tale of this act of British atrocity. After 1783, the celebrations stopped. They had no function anymore to rouse up anti-British sentiment. So those celebrations were replaced with the 4th of July.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the next decades, references to the Boston Massacre continued in accounts of the Revolution. It was seen by many as a significant event leading up to independence. But the names of the victims, including Crispus Attucks, were generally not shared. And again, sometimes mentioned in passing in a newspaper account that these were the people who were killed. But it wasn't until the 1830s and 40s that Attucks is once again identified racially in sources that start to proliferate in American culture.
Right, and that's the next phase that you identify, which is coincident with the rise of abolitionism, including participation by African-American abolitionists. Tell us what they see in Crispus Attucks.
Well, you're right. In the 1830s, of course, we have the emergence of immediatism, those white and black anti-slavery activists who were calling for the immediate end of slavery. So at this time when the abolitionist movement is starting to gear up, it's right about that time also. We're about 50 years or a little more after the end of the Revolution, and people tend to take those 50th anniversaries as an opportunity to take stock. Where are we today?
Right.
There's a lot of recollections of the soldiers of the Revolution, of the events of the Revolution, and one memoir in particular comes out, the famous memoir of the shoemaker, George Robert Twelves Hughes, who got a good bit of notoriety in the 1830s because he was a working man in Boston. He participated in the Boston Tea Party, apparently was a witness to the Boston Massacre and other key events there. And he identifies Attucks as a participant in this mob and identifies him as a mulatto, as a man of mixed race. And one of the most prominent Boston abolitionists at that time, a young man named William Cooper Nell, picked up on this and found some other sources that described Attucks and his role in the Boston Massacre. And at this moment, when African Americans are really starting to solidify their arguments for citizenship rights and for the abolition of slavery, Attucks becomes a very convenient symbol for them.
Right.
A black man, and the way his memory is resuscitated, it's a careful construction. They conveniently ignored his probable Native American ancestry and present him as an unequivocally black man who was there at the founding. He was the first to give his life for the independence of the American nation, hence the title, which was a phrase that they used occasionally during this period, the First Martyr of Liberty.
And they also read into his consciousness too, right? Don't they attribute motive to him, which is an unknowable thing from the historical record? They argue that he was a true blue patriot and knowingly put his life on the line and gave his life for the cause of liberty.
That's right, and that's one of the things that really gets this ball rolling. In the book, I refer to Attucks as a convenient blank slate.
That's right.
Because we know so little about his life, subsequent interpreters of his life have inscribed certain characteristics and personality attributes and motivations, as you say, to him to fit their own vision of who he was, who they want him to have been. And for these abolitionists, they were presenting him as a freedom fighter, as a patriot, as a man committed to the ideals of liberty, willing to give his life for the independence of the American nation. So it's this really interesting moment when Crispus Attucks goes from being essentially unknown by around 1840, but by the 1850s, he is one of the most prominent African-American figures to appear in publications, short essays, biographical sketches, speeches, calling attention to his role in the revolution as part of the argument for black citizenship rights.
Right, because if they can claim that African Americans were fighting for American liberty when it was being born, then there's no reason to deny them citizenship and equality in the 19th century. You know, that's really the principal argument for abolishing slavery.
Precisely. And again, they do initially, with William Nell providing the first biographical sketch of Attucks, or at least a description of his actions during the Boston Massacre, he didn't really stretch things too far in terms of making up things out of whole cloth. But you do see that start to happen a little later, with African-American writers in particular, sort of at a loss because they don't have much good information about Attucks. And some black writers who were generally respected as historians in the late 19th century, George Washington Williams, for one, simply made stuff up.
Right.
And it's those kinds of stories that really intrigued me as I was doing the research.
Right. And so this is in the post-Civil War period. Basically, two things happen that you talk about in your book. One is that in public memory, in public proclamations and public celebrations and books and so forth, Attucks just disappears. But within African-American communities, there's an effort to hold on to him. And then, as you just noted, to augment him, to give him, way more, a much deeper biographical story and to connect him even more precisely to the revolutionary fervor by saying he was a friend of Paul Revere, that he was a member of the Sons of Liberty.
Right.
Tell us a little bit more about that and how that works out, and also how within the African-American community, in ways that whites would not necessarily have seen, Crispus Attucks' name appears in all kinds of places.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, in the 1880s, again, we're just sort of out of the period of Reconstruction. There's been this sort of racial settlement, and it's a white supremacist settlement that emerges in the post-Reconstruction era. The South is left to do what it will with its black residents, and the white South has chosen to begin imposing a reign of terror, in effect, in addition to denial of citizenship rights and equal protection under the law and everything else, and segregated facilities. So just as segregation, Jim Crow segregation, comes to the fore by the end of the 19th century, historical memory is segregated to a degree. In 1888, there was a moment of biracial cooperation and memorialization in Boston with the erection of the Boston Massacre monument on Boston Common, commonly referred to as the Crispus Attucks Monument.
That's right.
And that went up in 1888. So there was support by the governor of Massachusetts, the city leaders of Boston, as well as the African-American community. But that sort of marks a turning point. In the aftermath of that monument going up, there was a lot of backlash from Bostonians who revived John Adams's characterization of Attucks as this unsavory outsider, this rabble-rousing ruffian who certainly doesn't deserve a monument in his honor.
Right.
And also in the 1880s was the last reference that I have found to Crispus Attucks in a mainstream American history school book until the 1960s.
Yeah.
So after the 1880s, Attucks disappears from school books, which I look a lot at school books in the book, ranging from the 1830s all the way up into the 2010s, because they're, I think, a really useful gauge of the kind of story Americans want their children to learn about the American nation.
Right.
So who's included in that story, who's excluded, what events are emphasized or what themes are emphasized, tells us a lot about how children are, in effect, being indoctrinated into this society of understanding who they are as American people. So Attucks disappears. So African Americans take up the challenge because it's clear that they are responsible for maintaining any kind of memory of Attucks as an individual, let alone as an American hero. So you have a lot of African American history books being written, sometimes to be used in African American classrooms, more often for a more general readership. A lot of these are geared toward juvenile audiences. So you have all kinds of stories emerging about Attucks, about, again, being friends with the Sons of Liberty and Paul Revere and being honored by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who probably never heard of him. And you have stories of Attucks giving speeches on Boston street corners around a throng of white colonists who were impressed with his leadership abilities, his literacy, he was well-versed in political philosophy. He was a good Christian. We don't know anything about any of those aspects of his life. We don't know if he could read or write. They wanted to construct this Crispus Attucks, who wasn't simply a rabble-rousing ruffian. He was of a part of the Sons of Liberty and their movement toward freedom. And that continues into the early 20th century. But they also, as you suggested, perpetuate his name in many other ways by naming institutions after him, hotels, community centers, old folks' homes, orphanages. Later on in the 20th century, VFW posts and American Legion posts, African-American ones, and even children being named Crispus Attucks Johnson or something along those lines. You see a lot of that in the early 20th century. So it's intriguing the way African-Americans try to perpetuate that name and maintain it. And then by the 20s and 30s, as you have a real sort of acceleration of more scholarly history being done by African-American scholars, some of them with PhDs like Carter G. Woodson.
Yeah, that's a period of the sort of the beginning of it's hard to say when African-American history begins as a discipline, but it's certainly, that's the period where it really begins to flourish and histories are written, archives are collected and so forth.
Yeah, and these folks, of course, are a lot more careful in their historical research. about Attucks and recognize that there are limitations to what can be said about him. So you start to see fewer and fewer of those references to him giving speeches on the corners in Boston.
Right.
But you do still have this presentation of him that implies a motivation of patriotism, of love of freedom, of the willingness to sacrifice one's life. Even scholars like Carter Woodson, who was a very solid historian, would present Attucks in this way in terms of being a patriot and deserving the same recognition that the other participants, white participants in the American Revolution, were receiving.
And then World War II presents a period in which, as if anybody knows anything about African-American history, it's really a watershed moment for African-American history, and because of the great changes that the war suggest and then actually that do occur. And there's a great debate within African-American communities about participation in the war, and if so, what might it bring about? Maybe this is an opportunity to gain, if not a full measure, a greater measure of freedom and citizenship and rights. So what happens during World War II and then just also the great interest of the American government in getting African Americans to support the war, to participate in the war as soldiers. So how does Crispus Attucks play a role in this?
It's interesting, even if you go back before World War II, with the Civil War and World War I, certainly, or even the Spanish-American War, each of those wars raised the question, should African Americans serve in the U.S. military? Mm-hmm. Would they be effective soldiers? And these are questions from the dominant society, from the white society, that whether should African Americans serve and would they be effective soldiers. Crispus Attucks is often brought up as an example of, even though he never served in the U.S. military or probably any other military, he is seen as a figure who was in battle for the American nation, gave his life for the American nation in a military-style conflict. So he's used as an example of Black manhood, Black patriotism, martial valor, and so on. You see that in all those wars leading up to World War II, and the same questions arise here. And again, as in some of those other wars, that's the questions among African Americans as to, should we fight in this war when we are clearly not being granted the citizenship rights that we're supposedly guaranteed? Why should we risk our lives for a nation that doesn't see us as equal members? But typically African Americans did their part, gave their lives, went to the battlefields, and in World War II, this was happening as well. One of the key debates among African American activists, and Black activism was really accelerating through the 20s and 30s and leading up to World War II, was the question of the segregation of the armed forces. Mm-hmm. In fact, in the Marine Corps, Blacks couldn't even enlist. So segregated troops were a big issue during this period, and Attucks' name appears once again. And the U.S. government was very concerned about African American morale. There were protests about the segregated military and the kinds of positions that African Americans held. There were conflicts in some of the training camps where African Americans were set upon by white citizens, especially in southern communities. So the Black press was a very vibrant institution at this time, and they came out with what they referred to as a double V campaign, pursuing victory against the nation's enemies abroad, but also pursuing victory for themselves in terms of full and equal citizenship rights at home. And the Black press was seen as something of a subversive force by the U.S. government, and they went to great efforts to try to appease African Americans in various ways, and there was a lot of propaganda, some of which did feature Crispus Attucks. There's a famous Frank Capra-directed film called The Negro Soldier, mm-hmm. which traced the history of Black involvement in all American wars and did make mention of Crispus Attucks near the beginning of that film. So Attucks' name did appear more and more frequently, and of course one of the great African-American heroes of the World War II era was a naval attendant named Dory Miller, who was served on, I forget the name of the battleship, but served on a ship at Pearl Harbor and was very notable for taking up one of the high-caliber machine guns on the deck when its crew had fled and shooting at Japanese planes. And he became a great example that was used by both African Americans and by the U.S. government as a symbol of African American, again, martial valor. And some comparisons were made in the Black press with Crispus Attucks, that just as in all previous wars, going back to Crispus Attucks giving his life for the American nation at the outset. Blacks have always done their jobs and risked their lives for the United States. So World War II did accelerate a lot of those processes, and Attucks' name became somewhat more widespread.
And then in the next phase, the Civil Rights era, which is always hard to pin down when it begins and so forth, but the Civil Rights era, quite understandably, Crispus Attucks comes back again as a figure that's held out as an icon and another reference point for the legitimate claims on full citizenship and rights by civil rights activists. And you note that textbooks, after many, many decades of not including reference to Attucks, begin to include him, even if it's just as a token mention in the course of describing the Boston Massacre. But it's more complicated. Tell us more about the Civil Rights era and the sort of conflicts that arise over the legitimacy of Crispus Attucks as a person of admiration.
Right. Well, the thrust of the civil rights movement that emerges in the 1950s is largely integrationist. The Brown versus Board of Education decision, the movement in Montgomery to integrate buses and to secure jobs for African Americans. It's largely a movement toward integration. And Attucks serves this agenda very well because he is there in a crowd of many white colonists. There were some other people of color in that mob as well. But Attucks, as one of the 5 who fell, a black man along with 4 white colonists, sort of symbolizes the multiracial nature of the founding of the American nation. And so he fit right into this thrust of the civil rights movement. The earliest reference that I found to Attucks in a 1960s textbook, and I certainly didn't look at all of them, but was in 1963. So that's a momentous year. It's the year that Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. It's also the year of the Birmingham movement.
Right.
Also the year of 4 little girls losing their lives in a church bombing in Birmingham after the March on Washington. So a big turning point, and we begin here to see Attucks inserted into American history textbooks' coverage of the Revolution and the Boston Massacre, albeit, as you said, as a token. I've seen some textbooks, you look at the 1960 version, there's a description of the Boston Massacre, no Attucks. If you look at the same textbook, the edition from 1968 or so, you see the exact same narrative of the Boston Massacre with one sentence added that one of the colonists killed was Crispus Attucks, a Negro man.
Right.
Or something along those lines. So it's simply inserted as a token gesture. But even this seemed to be sort of outrageous among a lot of the more traditionally minded people who wanted to see that narrative of essentially a white nation continuing through the civil rights era. They didn't like to see people like Crispus Attucks inserted into that narrative.
Right, because it complicates things. Because if you have how strange and how conflicting it is that a African American is killed in this great liberty moment.
Yeah, it raises some questions, and some textbooks, at least by the 1970s, were starting to insert language like calling attention to the irony of a man whose status was that of not a full citizen, someone who was bound to be enslaved, a former slave, giving his life for the freedom of the nation. But some historians and teachers would complain. Very famously, in 1968, the president of the Organization of American Historians, Thomas Bailey, argued that, read a quote here that I have in front of me, pressure group history of any kind is deplorable, especially when significant white men are bumped out to make room for much less significant black men in the interest of social harmony. So again, and this kind of sentiment that, Crispus Attucks, it's not so much he's complicating the story, but he's an insignificant figure who just doesn't belong in the story at all.
Right.
But again, among African Americans, as you suggest, it's a more complicated time as well, because by the mid-'60s, you have the rise of Black Power. And the Black Power narrative is, to a large extent, not an integrationist narrative. And there's a wonderful, it's wonderful to me because it calls attention to these complications, a quotation by Stokely Carmichael, one of the foremost Black Power advocates, coined the phrase, in fact. At one point, he says that a black man who goes out and throws a brick at a white cop is taking part in an uprising just like Crispus Attucks. But on another occasion, he also called attention to Attucks representing what he considered blacks' fundamental problem of always trying to be American first and black people second. And as he was quoted as saying, that's why we're catching hell the way we're catching it today. And he said that basically Crispus Attucks, who was the first man to die in the War of Independence, he was a fool. Right. He died for white folks while his black brothers and sisters were enslaved. He should have been fighting against the white folks instead of dying for them. So there had been sort of hints of that kind of sentiment earlier, certainly in the 1930s, some evidence of people holding that position about Attucks. But again, the 1960s is a very tumultuous time, and you have Attucks appearing much more frequently in mainstream popular culture, not simply in textbooks, but on television shows, to some extent in print, in other kinds of sources, in children's literature. And then the bicentennial of 1976 brings all things revolutionary to the forefront, and Attucks and his notoriety certainly benefit from that.
And then even after that, the latter part of your book really focuses on pop culture in the last, say, 20 years, and he continues to appear in music and in poetry and all manner of forms of pop culture.
Yeah, and all kinds of different kinds of vehicles of popular culture, from websites to, again, poetry, songs, advertisements, and his sort of interpretation of Attucks varies significantly in this period too. I mean, if we jump forward to the 2010s, there are a couple of organizations that emerge that take Attucks and his memory and shift the focus a bit. In 2006, in Southern California, a group of African Americans formed the Crispus Attucks Brigade of the Minuteman movement, that we don't hear a lot about now, but this was, well, or maybe we'll hear more about the Minuteman movement in the coming months. Right. But the people who were concerned with illegal immigration across the border with Mexico, and the Crispus Attucks Brigade was a group of African Americans who wanted to sort of put a stopper on that movement across the border. There's another group formed in 2011 called the Crispus Attucks Tea Party. So a very politically conservative group of blacks in Texas using Crispus Attucks' name as an identification of their movement with the cause of the American Revolution and the ideals of the American Revolution. So it's not simply those who want to create a multicultural society and expand African American rights. It's also those who have a more conservative political agenda who see value in Attucks' name as a patriot.
Right. He remains in the 21st century this convenient blank slate, as you point out. Well, we're almost out of time here, so I wanted to always get to my usual question, which is, why does this matter now? We always love to read works of history, regardless of what period they focus on, but ideally there's something to be said, or some aspect of it needs to speak to what's going on now in our country. And I mean, one thing is that the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre is coming up, so anniversaries are always important times to publish works. But what is it in the Crispus Attucks story that is relevant now in 2018?
One of the things that I think is really important about Attucks, regardless of whether you see him as a patriot or a rabble-rousing ruffian or whatever, is his presence. Attucks being part of this multiracial mob with immigrants and young people and working people and other people of color demonstrates the diversity of colonial and revolutionary America. A lot of Americans don't realize that 20% of the American population at that time was of African descent, 1 out of every 5 people. So Attucks' presence in that crowd, I think, is important regardless of his motivations, whether he was a patriot or just a drunken sailor looking for a fight. His presence in that mob shows the diversity of the public sphere in the American nation at the time that it was emerging as an independent nation.
Right.
But beyond that, in terms of our current political and social context, there's a lot about this book and about Attucks' story that I think is very relevant. Among historians, the idea of history as a contested terrain is kind of a truism. But this really is being exemplified in our public culture today when, the book came out in July of 2017, and within a couple of weeks, you have these events in Charlottesville, Virginia, with people taking to the streets, arguing for different versions of the past being preserved in the public landscape in the form of these Confederate monuments.
Absolutely.
Should they be preserved? Should they be taken down, moved to another spot, reinterpreted? And certainly with the new presidential administration's rhetoric of exclusion, its reluctance to distance itself from white supremacist hate groups, and the actions along the U.S. border, these questions about who belongs in American society, who can call themselves an American, a citizen, a patriot, these things really come to the fore. And that's, I think, a lot of what Attucks' story is about. Not so much Attucks himself, but the ways in which the story of the American nation has excluded people of color, has for a long time excluded the stories of working people and immigrants and women and Native Americans and so on. And people get comfortable with these kind of sanitized, comforting narratives that need to be complicated. So these questions of who belongs in American society and who gets represented in monuments in the public sphere, who gets placed in U.S. history textbooks and how are they discussed in those textbooks? These are important questions, and I think people are really becoming awakened to the idea that those are choices. The idea that a textbook is just the true story of the past is something that a lot of my students, even in college, come into the classroom with, and something I try to shake out of them right away. But I think that's one element in this book that I really try to explore, and that's one of the aspects of the study of history and memory or collective memory that I think is very important, recognizing that these narratives are constructed and trying to understand who constructs these narratives, when they construct them, and what their agenda is in constructing a narrative in a particular way is an important way to understand the past, that we have to really complicate our understanding and not be satisfied with these simplistic stories that have clear good guys and clear bad guys. And Attucks' tale, I think, helps us get to some of those things.
Right. History, properly understood, is always way more messy and complicated than we'd like to think or that we've grown accustomed to. So that, I think, is a terrific takeaway. Well, Mitch, this has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us at In the Past Lane. Thanks.
It's been my pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book, and thanks for your great questions.
Mitch Kachun is the author of The First Martyr of Liberty, Crispus Attucks, An American Memory, published by Oxford University Press and available everywhere. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, don't you just love July 4th? Come on. I say fireworks, you say...
Third-degree burns.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.